I thank you very, very much for your kind invitation. I'm honored and proud to give my talk for the centennial session of the Herodotus Helpline. A name I always found a little enigmatic, but well found and clever. After all, as we shall see, Herodotus' work was and still is a helpline, a form of distance communication for a worldwide community. And thus, in a sense, we are still playing his game. Before starting, I must apologize, first of all, for my English, which is rather poor, as you can hear. Secondly, I must confess that Herodotus was once a true love of mine, but in the last years, I've been a little unfaithful and have been concerned with other authors and other periods. However, first love never ends, and even though I may be not perfectly up to date on the latest news about European studies, I hope that what I'm about to say will not be too old-fashioned and trivial or obvious. In any case, I will try to talk to non-philologists, and specialists will excuse me if I'll say some trivialities, something that is well known. Well, Herodotus' text. We do not exactly know how Herodotus published this work. It is possible, maybe probable, maybe likely that, as some ancient sources suggest, he gave public lectures of his work, maybe of the whole work. This is a much debated question, which deserves a new and fresh analysis. In any case, the Histories, as we read it today, descends from a text that was written down by the author or written down for the author. One of the proofs, an element of evidence, is the use of the verb graphein, grapho. I'm writing, I write, in the text itself. And then we can see that this text was conceived for an audience that we can call a worldwide community, an audience virtually unlimited in space. Just like Hecatæus or Thucydides, Herodotus says at the beginning, Herodotus of Halicarnassus or of Turi. This means that he defines himself according to his city, and this means a Pan-Hellenic public. And then we find in the fourth book, for instance, references to an Eastern audience and a Western one. So Herodotus wrote a text that had to circulate all over the world, the Greek world at least, the Mediterranean world. But he also wrote a text that was intended for an audience virtually unlimited in time. In some passages, Herodotus historicizes himself, as Wolfgang Rösler said. The most famous example is at the beginning of the work, when he says, towns which were great in my own time. They were great in my own time. So his present is a past for the listener or the reader. It's a sort of epistolary tense, which is in fact spread also in ethnographic text. It means that the author puts his experience and his own life in the past in reference to an audience, which can be also even in a remote future, an audience which can comprehend us. So, we know that Herodotus wanted to leave a written text for a general audience. It may be that he dictated this text to one or more secretaries. We have no proof of this, of course. It was a practice which was relatively spread in ancient times. We have no proof, no evidence as for the possibility that he dictated his text. Maybe this could explain some corrections in stride, as Richmond Lattimore once called them. I mean the fact that Herodotus sometimes adds or correct a previous statement in the course of his speech, in the course of his work. Now I would like to share my PowerPoint. Here it is. Yes, I think you can see it. Well, for instance, there is a famous chapter at the end of book 7, where all to say, I shall now return to a point in my account where something was omitted before. This way of adding something finds parallels in other texts we certainly know were dictated. I reported here a passage taken from Le Dévissement du Monde de Marco Polo, Il Milione, as it is often called. A work that we know Marco Polo dictated to Rustichello da Pisa when he was in prison. And we find a similar case. At a certain point, Marco Polo says, or sachez que nous avons de mantiquer une nouvelle bataille, etc. That is, while dictating, he remembers that he has forgotten something, and he says when he can and when it finds useful to do that. So, it is possible that Herodotus dictated his text. But on the other side, Herodotus' text contains some passages that can, on the contrary, be interpreted as later additions inserted by the author in a previous draft, maybe on the written text. There is a wide debate on the proem, on the variant reading Herodotus of Halicarnassus or Herodotus of Turi. So both definitions are good for Herodotus, but we can think that Herodotus changed his self-definition in a second edition. But we can also think that an inappropriately zealous grammarian changed either Halicarnassian into Turian or Turian into Halicarnassian. The fact is that Herodotus' text drew the attention of ancient grammarians. We know that even the great, no lesser than Aristarchus, wrote a commentary on Herodotus. And so the Herodotus text was certainly influenced by the activity of grammarians. Benedetto Bravo has recently raised the suspicion that in the 1st century AD, a not very clever scholar completely revised the text by interpolating a lot of passages. The style and the content of this would be additions, would reveal their nature. So it is an idea that has not gained wide consent, but should be addressed seriously. In any case, grammarians surely were surely interested into Herodotus' language, and they revised the text at the level of its linguistic pages. This raises a serious problem, which is not easy to deal with. For we do not exactly know what Herodotus' idiolect sounded like, and according to which orthographic rules, if any, it was fixed in writing. And if we suppose that he dictated his text to different secretaries, of course, orthography could change. But we know from inscriptions that even within the very same text of as brief inscriptions, orthography in 5th century BC could radically change. So it's not easy to imagine how Herodotus or his secretaries wrote his idiolect, and we do not even know what his idiolect was like. Yes, we know many variant versions of Ionic dialect, but did Herodotus follow one specific dialect, or did he use a literary dialect? So the manuscript tradition, including papyri, offers a picture that is not fully consistent. So we see that forms that can be considered as equally legitimate in the Ionian dialect, for example, the plural form of accusative, polis and polias, are variously attested and may alternate in the same manuscripts. Sometimes you find the clusters of one form, but sometimes variability is more random. And even more problematic is the presence of forms that are not theoretically impossible, but are in a sense ungrammatical within the Ionic. For instance, the aorist infinitives of the type balein, epsilon, epsilon, iota, ni, are ungrammatical, but we know that this form was used by grammarians in Homer, probably in order to preserve the prosody of a different original form. Can we think that Herodotus imitated the written text of Homer by writing so, or were the grammarians who changed the normal balein in balein, for it could seem a little more Ionic, but mistakenly, of course. And even non-Ionic forms, like toisde instead of tuiside, the plural dative of the pronoun, so are likely to be a mere tribalizations of the Ionic forms due to copyists. But toisde, which we would say is an active form, can be read in Homer text. So we cannot exclude that Herodotus too employed them. So it is possible in principle that Herodotus may have used a literary dialect influenced by current Homeric texts. And moreover, his own grammatical habits and orthography could have been inconsistent. But on the other hand, it's possible that forms inspired by Homer or wrongly supposed to be more Ionic were introduced by grammarians. So it is not easy to decide in any single case which reading has to be chosen. So our current editions, with the exception of Rosen's, more or less depend on an editorial Vulgata, which was established in the 19th century. And the edition by Manuel Becker was fundamental in the establishment of this Vulgata. It was established in an age when a full exploration of manuscripts on the one side and the development of historical linguistics seemed to lead to the definition of a standard Ionic that could be ascribed to Herodotus, but the matter is much more complex. There are some recent articles by Olga Tribulato, which are very interesting from this point of view, and if you are interested in this field, I would suggest to read these articles. And even the papyri, that is ancient books reporting Herodotus text, show that different linguistic variants were already circulating in antiquity. But if we move from the formal constitution of the text to the material constitution of the text, as Romance philologists say, I mean, if we move from the analysis of the language to the variants that have some relevance as to what Herodotus says, not how Herodotus says. We find that papyri offer, on one hand, a number of readings that are surely better than those attested in our medieval manuscripts. Nor can we discern in the papyri through prefigurations of the main medieval families. In other terms, we cannot say that papyri testify as to the existence of different editions, more or less similar or equal to the different families of medieval manuscripts. On the other hand, we see that all medieval manuscripts share a number of common mistakes, but we can single out at least two main families which are characterized by their own mistakes, and these mistakes sometimes depend on the misreading of capital letters. So, this points to an origin of our medieval tradition in a late ancient Vulgata, with some mistakes common to all exemplars, from which two main lines of descent were derived through two different transliterations when Greek texts were transcribed from majuscule to minuscule, from uncial models to minuscule manuscripts. In the Byzantine age, Herodotus was not perhaps as popular as authors whose ethic or artistic language could be imitated, but was actively read in schools and within some circles. And this helps to explain the existence of at least two transliterations, and above all, the presence of different recensions of the text, as well as extensive contamination. So we can say that Herodotus' tradition was contaminated in antiquity and continued to be contaminated in the Middle Ages, in the Byzantine age. Now, contamination is one of these words of the jargon of philologists which bear a lot of ambiguities. Contamination is the contrary of purity. It evocates pollution, miasma. For non-philologists, I must say that contamination is no dirty business. Contamination, in fact, simply means that texts were widely read and were read in schools and were read by scholars who tried to understand them and to explain them. So if they found a mistake, they tried to find a different manuscript in order to compare the variant readings. And so they transferred one reading to the new text. In a school, all the pupils had their own Herodotus, but they made corrections according to what the teacher said. So contamination is simply a way to describe the fact that the texts were widely read and studied. So this means that the most popular authors, the authors who were mostly appreciated were subject to contamination. That is, to circulation of variant readings. And our modern editions, critical editions, are in fact contaminated texts, for we take variant readings from different witnesses. Of course, a modern critical edition is a critical work. It tries to find elements in order to motivate the choices we make. But also Byzantine scholars were able to do that. Most of all, in critical editions, we try to explain what we're doing, and we do not obliterate the dated witnesses in order to introduce new readings. We preserve ancient readings. So a critical editions allows the reader to check the work of the editor. Ancient scholars who created contaminated texts do not always make the same. And Herodotus tradition is, in part at least, and in good part, a contaminated tradition because Herodotus was widely read. In spite of this, we can single out different families, lines of descent of the manuscripts. And scholars agree on the fact that there are two main families of manuscripts, which are usually defined as Stirps Florentina, the family of Florence, and Stirps Romana, the family of Rome. So the most ancient representative of the Stirps Florentina is a manuscript of the 10th century, of the early 10th century, a wonderful manuscript. I can show it. Yes, it is this on the left. Which bears some traces of its descent from ancient exemplars. You see, for instance, at the end of the first page, so I reproduce, there is a number, Kiki et eta, it means 2322. It is the so-called stichometry, the calculation, the compute of the lines in an old roll, for each book corresponding to a roll. And at the end of a book, you find the calculation of the lines, which was also used in order to pay the scribe, the copyist, according to the job he had done. Then there are other manuscripts which share some mistakes and some features with this authoritative manuscript. There is especially another manuscript from Rome, from the Bibliotheca Angelica, while the first one I showed you, the Bibliotheca Medici Laurenziana Plutei 73, is usually designed with the siglum A. Another manuscript, which is akin to it from Rome, is usually designed with the siglum B. And then there are other manuscripts which are more or less similar to this. It is a problem in a sense, the fact that B is very, very similar to A. It has only a very limited number of variant readings. They are almost twins, in a sense. And this is a family with its own features. Then we have another family, the Stirps Romana, which is characterized by some common innovations. And maybe the most apparent innovation is the absence of some chapters in the first book. We can trace the work of a redactor who abridged and also bowdlerized the text. For among the parts which are left off, there are also some chapters with the sexual content, but not only that. It is an abridged version in the first book. And then this family has a number of differences from the front of the first one. Its most ancient representative is a manuscript which is in the Biblioteca Apostolica Vaticana, the Vaticanus Graecus 2369. Its usual signum is D. And this is an ancient manuscript, it's of the 10th century. There is then a group, a wide group of other manuscripts which are which are close to D, but all appear to descend from a lost common ancestor, which was usually called Beta. Nigel Wilson, in his editions, has renamed this group as R. We can see that this subgroup within the Stirps Romana descends from a manuscript with variant readings. It was a contaminated manuscript. The manuscripts of this group bear the evidence of the work of a Byzantine scholar, or more Byzantine scholars, who collected the varie lectiones. We can make an example which was made already by Carl Lude, and it's very clear. Oh, sorry. Problem in visualizing it. Yeah. Can you see the wall of the slide? Do you hear me? Sorry.
Hello, Aldo. Yes, we see it. We can hear you just fine.
Yeah, sorry. I have a part which I cannot see. No problem. So, if you see the apparatus criticus, you see at line 2392, according to Wilson's edition, which I'm using just for it was easier to find the PDF. But I don't think it's the best edition possible, but we'll say something at the end. You see, there are two main variant readings, a Pelasan and a Palesan. And then you find the readings of R, S, V, which are parts of this subgroup, the group of Beta or R. And R as Doko e Stalesan, where Doko is clearly a comment of the copyist, who wrote, I think I should write a Stalesan. Maybe he couldn't read his model well, or maybe he was trying to make a conjecture in presence of a text which was very confused, for it had many varie lectiones, many variant readings at the same point. So, there are many other examples of this phenomenon in this subgroup. So, as we shall see in a moment, there has been a vast, wide debate as to whether this group is a descendant of D, the manuscript of the Vaticana, or is derived from a parallel line. And the problem is that it is not easy to give a definite answer, just because this group is contaminated, there's many different readings, and it's not easy to find the elements to demonstrate its descent from D or from a parallel line. So the remaining manuscripts, apart from these two groups, I could say many other things, but I try to be brief. The remaining manuscripts are or the scripti, this means copies of surviving manuscripts, or the result of further contamination between the two main branches. And it's not easy to use the other manuscripts in order to reconstruct a stem. So we know in principle that A on one side and the D on the other are the purest representatives of the two branches. As for the other manuscripts, it's not easy to evaluate their readings. If we have time and leisure enough, we'll make an appendix. But I would like to explain that this result, the preeminence of A and D as representatives of two branches, which can both preserve a good text of Herodotus, a good paradosis, as philologists say in their jargon, good tradition. This is a result which was attained between the 18th and 19th century, but it was a long process. And I would like to make some examples of the way we arrived to this conclusion. Herodotus Editio Princeps was published by Aldus Manutius in 1502. And as often happened, it was based on recent contaminated manuscripts, which had several particularly copy errors. In 1570 and then in 1592, Henri Etienne or Edicus Stephanus reproduced Aldus' text, but he annotated some variant readings in the margins, for he had seen other manuscripts. But up to the 18th century, Herodotus' printed text was substantially depending on manuscripts of little or no value. Let's make an example. This is an example I usually make in my classes of classical philology, for it has some interest. These are reproductions of some editions, and the passage in question is 927. Herodotus is saying that the Athenians fought with the Amazons when they invaded Attics. But the text printed by Aldus had strange expressions. I don't know whether you can see, but es Amazonidas tas apothecas tas apotermodontos. The Amazons, then this strange word, the tas apothecas, the storehouses or the stores, from Thermodon. Stephanus knew that some manuscripts did not have tas apothecas. And Thomas Gale, 1679, said, referring to tas apothecas, ec dele, cancel these words. For he said, one important manuscript has not these words, and the translation of Valla doesn't know this word, and so on. Gale was right, but in spite of his sensible observations, through the first part of the 18th century, there was a wide debate as to interpretation of tas apothecas. Gronovius, who published a very important edition of Herodotus in 1715, tried to correct tas apothecas and proposed tas apothetas, the undesirable Amazons. And then many other scholars spent all their ingenuity in order to correct tas apothekas. Yeah, I reported a page from the edition of Besseling who gives an account of these attempts. And they invented the very, very ingenious conjectures. Tas autecastas, the self-willed Amazons, or the Amazons from Themisira on the river Thermodon. Friedrich Ludwig Abresch, which was no stupid scholar, but maybe a little too fantastic, postulated a complicated hyperbaton, some ellipses, the insertion of a word, and tried to say that Herodotus meant in the stores of our great deeds, we have the action we performed against the Amazons. So Peter Besseling in 1763 put an end to this wasteful display of ingenuity by observing that most of the manuscripts he knew did not have the words as apothekas, and that this word could not be considered as ancient tradition, but were only the result of a lithography, and they were found only in some secondary and negligible witnesses of the text. In fact, we know this word from a manuscript from Modena. Here you have the passage in question. Wilson, of course, does not print tas apothekas and doesn't say anything in upper and apparatus, and he's right. Rosen, who is always a little more rich in his apparatus, says that apothekas, tas apo, is found in M, which is a manuscript from Modena of the 16th century. But you see, I made this example to show how the fact that the Editio Princeps and then the Vulgata was founded on secondary manuscripts sometimes compelled or stimulated scholars to make very ingenious conjectures which were based on nothing, or the particular mistakes of very late manuscripts. Besseling had already realized that the true tradition of Herodotus had to be based on the two families. He had a clear idea of these two families. But the point is that in the 18th and in the 19th century, the most ancient representative of the Stirps Romana, the manuscript of the Vaticana, D, was not known. So, on the one side, we had A, the manuscript of Florence, and other very ancient manuscripts for the Stirps Florentina. On the other side, we had the manuscript of the subgroup Beta, or R, as Wilson says, which are clearly contaminated and are more recent, 14th, 15th century. So there was a tendency to say the best tradition is that of the Stirps Romana, Stirps Florentina, sorry, Aena, while the Stirps Romana is not so important. In the 18th century, there was a wide debate on this matter, and debate which would be interesting to reconstruct in detail, but I see that, alas, it's already 8:45 in Italy. In the 18th century, the debate on the tradition and the editions of Herodotus was very intense, but there are many reasons for that. There is, of course, the development of scientific classical philology, but we should not forget that the great success of classical philology in the 18th century was also based on the role that Greek and Latin texts had in education, in the schools, the gymnasia in Germany. Herodotus was read in schools. It was read in the Secunda, which is the penultimate class of the secondary school. And around the middle of the 19th century, a vast market opened up school needed commented editions of Herodotus. It was also a big business, a great business. And the main publishing houses, the publishing giants, launched a series of commenting texts and recruited teachers in the schools in order to prepare these texts for the schools. So this leads to introducing one of our heroes, with Heinrich Marcus Stein, who was a school teacher, a school professor, we should say, in German gymnasia. At a certain degree of the career, a school teacher could bear the title professor. He was an extraordinary figure. He studied Greek and Latin relatively lately, but then he studied in Göttingen and Bonn, and he was in Göttingen in 1848, and he took part in the democratic movement. We also have a letter of his to Karl Marx. He wrote to Karl Marx and proposed himself as a correspondent for the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, and he closed his letter with democratic greetings, aufrichtigen democratic Gruß, and then he signed Studiosus Philosophiae and Rei Publicae, more or less a student of the Faculty of Arts and engaged in politics and democratic. So in the following years, he became closer to the establishment, but he always remained a very independent personality. Then he became a director of gymnasium. So in the 50s, he was charged by one of the greatest public houses of Germany, Weidmann, to publish a commentary to Herodotus. And he entered in competition with others enterprises of the same kind. One of his competitors was Karl Wilhelm Krüger, another very interesting person. For he too was a very independent and democratic man, to the point that he retired from school, for he was always quarreling with the directors and the other colleagues. And he lived on the meager incomes of his own publishing house, producing commentaries and grammars. And he also published a very interesting and important commentary to Herodotus. So when other commentaries and that of Stein began to be published, he started a very bitter polemics against his rivals, against his competitors. But the very nemesis, or the real competitor of Stein, was Karl Abicht, who in the same years was preparing a school commentary for Teubner, the other publishing giant of the age. So Abicht and Stein kept quarreling all their life long. And at the beginning, Abicht was an ardent supporter of the prevalence of the Stips Florentina, while Stein defended the value of the Stips Romana. It's interesting to say that Stein was a very honest person. At a certain point, understood that the Stips Florentina had its merits, or it was even better than Stirps Romana. And so, while publishing in different editions, commentary in these editions, I have here a sketch of his work. He progressively said the Stirps Florentina is better and is the very basis for the edition of Herodotus. But he kept quarreling with Habicht, for he attacked Habicht in his own field, also in his own field. He said Habicht has not really understood how good is the manuscript of Florence, and he also has reported some readings in an incorrect manner and so on. So I'm giving a summary, but if you read the articles they wrote, it was terrible attacks, also with the personal attacks. So it was a real feud, which ended in a reconciliation, in a sense, of the two rivals. But Stein was in fact the real winner, because he published an edition in 1869 and 1871, which was a masterpiece. And then he kept reviewing and correcting his commentary, you can see, up to 1908, always adding and improving. And Stein's commentary remains a tool that every Herodotus scholar should use. I would say we should always compare the different editions with commentary, for sometimes there are good ideas in former editions, not in the last. Well, in the 19th century, the preference for Stirps Florentina was established. A general preference for Stirps Florentina was established, but this couldn't obscure the fact that the Stirps Romana also preserves ancient tradition. The problem was that the Stirps Romana did not have any representative more ancient and better than the subgroup beta. In fact, however, a better witness had survived and had been rediscovered in 1868 by Carlo Dilthey, who was a philologist in Göttingen and the brother of Wilhelm Dilthey, the philosopher, which is maybe more known. He could consult this manuscript in 1878 in the library of the Collegio Romano at Rome, but he could collate only the first book, and this collation had remained unpublished until 1911. And in 1870, this manuscript had disappeared as a consequence of the annexation of Rome to Italy. For the in front of the menace of the confiscations of ecclesiastical properties, many manuscripts were concealed. Now we know that this important manuscript of Herodotus, which Dilthey had seen in the Collegio Romano in 1868, was brought to Castel Gandolfo, and only in 1912 it was bought by the Biblioteca Vaticana. In the meantime, Carl Hude published his edition for the Oxford Classical Text. The first edition is 1908, and it was no real improvement on Stein's Editio Maior. In 1912, Hude published a second edition in which he could make an account of the new readings of D, which had in the meantime made known, and also some readings of the papyri. But he did not yet seen D. Only in 1927 he could publish his third edition, where he could give a full account of the variant readings of D. And from that moment, the authority of the Stirps Romana, more or less like Stirps Florentina, is a result that we can taken for granted. So we could say many, many other things, but ora ruit. We could just make a hint to the fact that after Ude's edition, Paul Maas examined the tradition and said, well, if D is an authoritative representative of the Stirps Romana, we can say that Herodotus tradition is more or less like this. We have on one side the Stirps Florentina, on the other side the Stirps Romana, divided into two branches, D on one side and the group RSV, beta or R, is like on the other. Maas was trying to say that Herodotus had a pure tradition, which could be analyzed in stemmatic terms. If this stemma is true, we could say, well, whenever the reading of RSV is the same of that of ABCOA, we can accept this reading as the reading of the archetype of the more ancient stage of the tradition, and we can exclude the reading of D for obvious thematic reasons. The fact is that we know RSV is deeply contaminated, and sometimes these manuscripts draw their readings from A. So it can be that D is right against A and RSV. When there is contamination, you have not a closed recension, and you cannot use the stemma as a mechanism in order to choose the readings. Yeah, you have a sketch of some other proposals of stemmas or stemmata or partial stemmata. Due to the nature of beta, the contaminated nature of beta, it is not easy to make a stemma. And the last attempt by Raffaella Cantore draws an interesting stemma of the Stirps Romana here. But you see, there are these lines, these not continuous lines, that mean contamination from A to D, from A to B, and so on. This is a realistic picture of the traditions. This means that A on one side and D on the other are important representatives, but we cannot use the other manuscripts in order to choose between A and D. Judicium, the personal judgment of the editor, has to be used in these cases. I'm simplifying maybe too much, but I don't want to be boring. We could say something about Rosen's editions. Rosen was a linguist, and he tried to publish a text of Herodotus according to grammatical rules. I don't want to be too tranchant, but I could say, and many agree with me, that many or most of these rules are simply inventions or harsh reconstructions, which are not easy to share. I imagine you expect some words about the most recent event in Herodotian scholarship. I mean, Nigel Guy Wilson's 2015 edition for the Oxford Classical Text, which is intended to replace Hoode's edition in the same series. Well, I'll say something. As I said before, I don't think that Wilson's edition can be used as a standard text of Herodotus. As any edition, it has some strengths and some weaknesses. Among the strengths are indeed the fact that it could take into account a lot of papyri. And so you find in apparatus many readings that all these editions couldn't know. Then he took from Stein the idea that some passages in Herodotus could be second thoughts, could be additions made by the author himself. And this could explain some difficulties in the syntaxis and so on. This could be a good idea, I don't know, but one should not abuse of this remedium Steinianum, as a reviewer has called it. Then, an element which is a feature which is interesting in Wilson's editions is the amount of conjectures that he reports, especially conjectures of modern scholars, of Paul Maas himself, or John Enoch Powell, who did a great work on Herodotus text. Some conjectures of a Swede scholar, Victorinus Pingel, which was a very intelligent scholar, and some conjectures of himself. He also accepted some conjectures of mine, and maybe he was wrong in this. But speaking of conjectures, we move to the weaknesses of this new edition. Apart from a little attention to the ancient history of the text, and apart from the fact that he has not re-examined the manuscripts, so sometimes you find some mistakes which are simply taken from the previous editions. Apart from that, yeah, he's tried to improve the number of manuscripts, and especially the representative of the Stips Romana, but as a reviewer said, he didn't succeed in this. In my opinion, he chose the wrong manuscripts. But apart from that, I think that he accepted too many conjectures into the text, and maybe reported too many conjectures in the apparatus. For instance, I saw that Powell is quoted almost 500 times in the Apparatus Criticus. Powell was a genius, apart from what one can think of his ideas in many fields. From philological point of view, was a raisonneur. But this is the point. I will make an example. Just one example, but we can examine many passages in Wilson's edition in order to show that is too open to accepting conjectures when it is far from necessary, in my opinion, to do that. An example that could seem a little strange, but I think it is meaningful. It is a passage from the first book, chapter 53. And here Herodotus is describing some gifts that Croesus made to the sanctuary of Amphiaraus in Thebes. And among this gift is Aicmen steren pasen crusein toxisten telon keon moios cruseon. This is Wilson's text. If you see the apparatus, manuscripts have tesilonchesi, the plural, and then you find a strange signal. But first of all, let's give a translation of the text. The text says, a spear all of solid gold, the shaft being of gold also, as well as the points. For manuscripts have tesilonchesi, the plural. Wilson prints telonche and says that he took this conjecture from SY, and then he writes 1824. I'm supposing that Nigel Wilson was posing a puzzle to readers, of course, but it is not impossible to solve it. For this SY is a scholar who wrote an article in the Classical Journal of 1824, which was a collection of different observations on different authors. I suspect him to be Solomon Young, who was classical tutor at the Stepney Academical Institution in those years, but I'm not sure of that. In any case, if you read the text of SY, or Solomon Young, if you can say so, sorry, he just observed that the use of the plural is a singularity. I don't know whether the singularity of expression has been observed. So I'm not sure that the poor SY really intended to correct the text, but that is what Wilson has done. Well, if one reads ancient commentaries, one can find in Kruger's commentary, you remember Carl Wilhelm Kruger, an explanation of the plural. I'm sorry, I'm trying to. Well, Kruger said in his annotation, Kruger said, über die beiden Spitzen der Lanze zu Xenophon. Unfortunately, I cannot read the text Xenophon and the passage of Anabasis. I have a problem in my screen, but I think you read the passage in question. So Kruger said, Herodotus is speaking of more than one point, 2 points, and he said, if you want to understand why, please read Xenophon Anabasis, this passage. And this passage is very interesting, for in that passage, Xenophon says that this people, this Asiatic people, had a spear, very long spear, which had only one point, and use the same term long. So, the Greek Xenophon noticed that another people has a spear with only one point. This means that for a Greek, a normal Greek spear has more than one point. 2 points, of course. And so Kruger was right. A passage like that demonstrates that the plural should not be changed in Herodotus text. Because for a Greek audience, there is nothing strange in a spear that has more than one point. On the contrary, what is strange is a spear with only one point. So, I think that in this case, Wilson adopted a conjecture which modifies Herodotus' text without trying to understand the reality that was behind Herodotus' text. I know that it seems normal to think that spears have only one point, but it's not always so. Wilson often makes so. He adopts conjectures with, in my opinion, simplify or the text, or change the text where there is no need to change it. It is true that a philologist must have a head and not a pumpkin on their shoulders, and the brains not padding in their head. This is a quotation from Hausmann. But also arguing in defense of a transmitted text that is not prima facie obvious implies having a head on one's shoulders, as well as being open to less plain truths in different linguistic and historical contexts. This is always true, but it's especially true in front of the delusive simplicity of Herodotus. Herodotus sometimes seems simple, but is very often ironical and says more than one can read at first glance. So correcting his text is something that one always does at their own risk. In a sense, the editor of any ancient text, but of Herodotus, especially Herodotus, is just a traveler who ventures into a foreign land and is called to understand local traditions before judging them. For custom is king of all, or if you prefer, everything is possible in the long course of ages. Among the many things Herodotus teaches us, certainly is a kind of ironical openness to different perspectives and possibilities. I think that philologists who deal with this text should try to take advantage of this lesson. They have to use their reason, of course, and not accept the mistakes of traditions. But before correcting, they must try to understand the reality which is behind the text and the not so simple mentality and mental set of Herodotus. In my opinion, Wilson has not always or has rarely do that. So one can learn a lot from his edition, and it's also useful in order to provocate reactions, in order to posing doubts about the text. But in most of the cases where he corrects, no correction, in my humble opinion, is really needed. That's why I would advise to use a more balanced text like that of Ude as standard text. Of course, I hold Nigel Wilson in high esteem for all his work, and I'm not criticizing him as a scholar. I think that his editions doesn't give the best text of Herodotus, which is available. So I thank you, and I apologize for having talked a little more than I was allowed to do. I'm sorry.